All right, I'm talking to Kenny Xu. Kenny Xu is the president of Color Us United, which is a nonprofit organization working towards a colorblind can we say colorblind America? And he's the author of two books. One of those is his most recent book is The School of Woke, and his previous book is called An Inconvenient Minority. Is that correct, Kenny?
Yeah, and inconvenient minority, but yeah, same thing.
An inconvenient minority. Thank you. Kenny, thank you so much for talking today. How you doing?
Glad to be on. Excited.
Awesome. Were you connected? Were you associated with the recent Supreme Court decision regarding Harvard admissions and affirmative action? What do you know about that? What do you see about that?
Yeah, I served on the board, and also I was the person who really helped to propel the case to national attention through public relations and communications. My book, An Inconvenient Minority, covers it extensively, but basically they were lowering their standards to attract lesser qualified Black and Hispanic Americans at the expense of white and Asian Americans.
What made you so passionate about this topic? When did you get so into this?
I think caring about culture, I think that people who have solid habits should be rewarded. Like, why can't we help to fix the problems in society without having to denigrate those who are actually doing it right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's can you steel man the other side of the argument? I know you've already spoken about the sense of denigrating the success of others. Obviously, a lot of your work is dedicated to not seeing color, not seeing race, moving past that. But just for the sake of completeness, having been so involved in this project, been so involved in this issue, what are like the best arguments for a system like affirmative action?
I think the other side's best argument is that Blacks uniquely have experienced slavery in America in a way that no other minority has, and so they deserve special treatment.
Mm-hmm. Is there a sense that maybe like an educational experience can be enriched by having a diversity of different students from different backgrounds?
No, I think it's a pretty bad argument.
It's a bad argument. Okay.
There's no evidence for it. So
what'd you say?
There's no evidence for it.
No evidence for it. Okay.
So it's a bad argument.
Fair enough. And what about the cases where like if two students are exactly equal, let's say like the scores are the same, everything the same, in that case, would it be okay for an institution to prefer use race as like a determining factor?
No.
No? Okay.
But I mean, in the extremely rare case where they're exactly equal, somebody's going to have to be selected. So I'm not going to have a strong hatred against it if they do, but that's not the case. The case is the standards are vastly lowered for Blacks and Hispanics.
Okay, cool. All right. This most recent book is called The School of Woke. And it's about the infiltration of critical race theory and wokeness into America's school systems. And woke is a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. One question I sort of wanted to ask you, since I know a lot of people are wondering this nowadays, is the most recent Barbie movie, is that woke? But the serious question is, what is wokeness, of course? Like what constitutes as woke? And how do you think about this discourse around wokeness going on today?
Woke is the privileging of somebody's viewpoint because they are at the bottom end of the intersectionality pyramid. That's what it means. So basically, your viewpoint should be valued more because you are gay rather than straight, Black rather than white, and a woman rather than man.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Let's talk about the book. So in the book, you describe a sense in which America's schools are being filled with this ideology, this ideology has infiltrated the schools, you would say. Do you want to sort of speak briefly to that, to sort of the thesis of the book, to sort of the effect that you see this as having on America's education system?
Whether it's the direct teaching of critical race theory in the K-12 schools, which is happening already in many school districts, and I've cited a few in the book, or it's the teaching of systemic racism in America, or it's the admonition against colorblindness that a lot of teachers are going to, which are all critical race theory tenets. The whole idea of lowering standards for people of color, seeing people for color, hatred against the white man, queering kids, because queer people are oppressed and people like being oppressed these days. that is a new idea, not a new idea, it's really an ancient idea, but it has gotten a new Marxist connotation, and it has entered the school system, and it is hurting young children, because when young children are learning to place their identity, and I argue this in the book, when they learn to place their identity and something that is fundamentally us versus them, they're not going to be inspired to succeed. They're not going to be inspired to help others, to improve their own standards, and it shows.
Mm-hmm. America's school system is fairly large. I went to school in America. I assume you went to school in America. There's lots of different schools. I'm sure, went to very different schools and on and on. What is like the scope of America's education system that you're like interested in? So you mentioned now K through 12, but I think there seems to be a focus in the book on like poorer schools, certainly schools with large minority populations. Would you say that this is like largely an issue for like a specific kind of low income community school, or not necessarily? How do you think about that?
I think in places where kids are already experiencing various forms of violence and trauma in their lives, such as low income communities, critical race theory makes everything worse. Because you're teaching these kids now that the whole society is stacked up against them. They can expect this reality in their life for the rest of their lives. And the reality is, most kids who live in inner city Baltimore do not want to end up in inner city Baltimore. And I know this because I've interviewed kids in inner city Baltimore, and they say Baltimore is a whirlpool. No matter how much you try to get out, you're stuck in there. I don't want people to be stuck in their scenarios. I don't want people to be stuck in failing institutions, but critical race theory teaches the ideology of failure, that failure is okay, that it's embedded, that people can't work hard to get out of a system because the system is fundamentally corrupt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you described talking to those kids. When I listened to your book, because I listened to it, I felt like there was a sense in which you did a very precise analytical analysis of a phenomena. But of course, behind that is also a human story, right? There are like human kids in these experiences. I'm curious if you can maybe speak to sort of how you think about like, yeah, that human story, which to some extent you did just now, talking about this kid that you spoke to doesn't want to be stuck in Baltimore. But I mean, I know from my experience reading about this, what I think is a real education crisis, it's really heartbreaking, right? There's like a real deep tragedy at the core of what's going on in these failing schools. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. In recent articles, which have not come out yet, I talk about Maryland's public school system. And basically there are some teachers who can't get control, who feel like custodians in their schools. They don't feel like they are actually teaching these kids to learn, but really just to keep them intact. And if you're a custodian, that's not why you become a teacher. You teach because you want these kids to learn, because you love learning, you want them to learn. So we're fundamentally misplacing the role of teacher and student in these schools. That's I think a big issue that's going on, is that teachers don't feel valued. They don't feel like their teaching is valued by the students, and when they go to the administration to complain about it, the administration doesn't care, because the only thing the administration cares about is passing kids from grade to grade. They don't care about them actually achieving the standardized metrics, nor do they care about them actually learning the content.
Yeah, I mean, I know some people who work in the public school system, and not even in the worst hit public schools, and yeah, I mean, like, I think you're expressing that being a public school teacher being any teacher, I guess, really is a very hard job, especially in systems and situations where the kids are unruly and there's a lot of going on in that respect. I think part of the story is the fact that I think the number is 9 million American kids have food insecurity. I think part of the story is this deep poverty that America has. You have a quote in your book. I wrote it down for myself somewhere. Even if I can't find it right now, that's okay. But you compare success scores, like scores on a standardized test, this PISH test, I think it's called, or PISA, right? PISA test. And you say that like Americans, if you break down America's scores on this international standardized test, you have like white Americans and Asian Americans doing well on the level of like the industrialized world. And you have African American kids, Black kids doing like on the level of like the third world, And so like there's this deep crisis in our country. And I feel like by the time that gets to the school system, when you have kids that are coming from food insecurity, like meaning they might be hungry, and when you have school systems, and again, I was in research and preparation for this interview, like I was, searched on like ProPublica for things they've done about like our public school system. You read about schools where there's not enough bathrooms to service the kids, and kids like soil themselves. They don't have heating or in the winter and cooling in the summer. It's like already too late in a sense. Like the teachers, like it's hard to imagine how you can even fix that without addressing more fundamental issues. Would you agree with that?
I think some of the narratives about resources in schools are flawed. Maryland, for example, has some of the most equitably distributed resources in the schools. Actually, Baltimore City gets very little local funding because there's such a deprived tax base there, but they get a ton of state funding to compensate for it. And so they're actually funded at an equal level per capita as the wealthy Montgomery County, Maryland is. But Baltimore City scores are terrible. They're like the worst in the country. 0 public schools have proficiency rates of higher than 10% in math. So it's not just resources, it's also culture. It's bad policy too.
Right.
But yeah, I think I'll end it there.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. And when I think of culture, I think of trauma. It's a synonym that comes to mind. Like when I read these stories and like when you grow up in unsafe environments, things like that, I just, it's hard. Like kids who are traumatized, they misbehave, they're unruly. And like the last thing they're going to be interested in is like, the ratio of secant to cosecant, like on a test. Like it's like a really hard problem. That's interesting. An analogy that comes to mind when I think about this problem and I think about this crisis, which again, I just want to underscore, like, to me personally, like, I think a lot of people don't appreciate, again, just like how severe this crisis is. Like people like me, like grew up in white America, in the suburbs, like there's no sense of like how much of a parts of America are like basically not in the first world to some extent in terms of the food insecurity and the safety of their neighborhoods and things like that. And drug addiction, for example, among other things, and trauma. And so just to underscore the tragedy of that and the magnitude of that. So I guess one of the divisions of like policies, like options that sort of come to mind is sort of like when we think about drug addiction, right? America has had and currently has like a drug problem. Especially in the 80s and 90s, had like the crack epidemic. And there's sort of two schools of thought. There's like a school of thought of like harm reduction, which says like, someone's drug addicted, let's give them a needle exchange. And the other one is like tough love. You're drug addicted, you're going to have to suffer the consequences of your actions. Does that feel like a similar analogy to the kind of debate going on about how to deal with these like broken schools?
Yeah, I think we've gotten too far along the indulgence category, and here's the evidence to prove it. Mississippi implemented a mandatory 3rd grade reading exam that all students have to pass. Black students, white students, they're not lowering their standards for anything. And people were like, you're going to cause kids to get held back because they can't pass this exam. Shouldn't you lower the standards? Shouldn't you pass them anyway? They said, no, we're not going to do it. And they passed this law in 2013. And in 2023, their math and reading scores went from 49th in the nation to 21st in the nation. And among high poverty individuals, 1st in the nation. High poverty, mostly Black, by the way. High poverty individuals, 1st in the nation. The tough love worked, and the tough love worked because the teachers rallied behind it. They're like, nope, we're not going to make excuses anymore. If we need to pull some of these 1st graders aside, we're going to pull these 1st graders aside. We're going to give them after school tutoring, and the school system paid for that. But the important part of this is that the funding went to directly helping kids achieve the goals. The funding did not go to administrators, bureaucrats, DEI officers, counselors, tech specialists, and lawyers. It went to after-school tutors. That's what we should be spending our money on.
Yeah, I think that's a very important message, and it's the message of the book. And that makes a lot of sense. One thing that comes to mind, it sounds like a very inspiring story, and I hope that your book and others will help sort of spread the word about these, the ways in which that may or may not, can be replicated. Hopefully, can be replicated across the country. I've read stories though, just as sort of something to be aware of, like the way when No Child Left Behind tied school funding to test scores. There's like it creates very perverse incentives. And it seems to create a lot of potential distortion of those grades, because like the teachers are the ones grading the regions and like grading the standardized tests, and they're also the ones whose jobs are dependent on kids passing, you know. And so I would, just be hesitant in situations where there's a conflict of interest, where like schools are going to close down if teachers don't shepherd kids, past certain numbers. That to me seems like a dangerous pattern. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, schools close down all the time. Why should we keep failing schools alive? I don't understand the reasoning there. There's this weird doublespeak that in the education world that School of Woke tries to tackle, where the first thing that they say is America's education system is failing. We are 29th in the world. Our kids aren't educated. They're not studying. And on the second hand, they speak, oh, but my school's doing great. Our school is just give us more money. With more money, we can do it because, sure, we're failing, but we're not failing. Are you failing or are you not failing? If you're failing, we need to close down the failure. If you're not failing, we need to fund it, and we need to fund success. We need to fund successful experiments. That's the reality that schools don't want to live in. They don't want to live in a world where they are judged on their outcomes. Yet we live in that world. It's called capitalism. Capitalism will judge you on your outcomes. If you don't produce, you don't get. And why can't we do the same with education? I don't understand.
In the world of education, how tightly correlated are test results to income across the country?
They have depending on who you ask, the R squared is anywhere between like 20% and 40%. Is anywhere between like 15% and 40%. So pretty high.
Yeah, pretty high. So, I mean, to me, it feels like that's part of the puzzle, right? like family income, meaning it's just, to put all the weight on the teachers or the school feels like it sort of misses an important piece there, like the potentially 40% R squared of success, which is,
yeah. You know what that shows, by the way? Do you know what the such a high R squared shows? It shows that public schools aren't doing their job. Because if a public school was doing its job, we know that people are born with innate intelligence in poor communities all the time. If you're born with innate intelligence, and we know that intelligence is in part genetic, if you're born with an innate intelligence, then a good public school system should be able to shepherd that. But instead, what we see is that the wealthy parents shepherd that better than the low income parents. Why? Because the wealthy parents spend money outside the school system, outside the typical school day, so that their kids can get the enrichment that they need. That means the public school system isn't doing their job, because they should be doing that within the 8-hour school day in which all students are supposed to go to school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see here. Let's talk about racism a little bit. At the core of this question of CRT is how we think about race in America. How important is race in America? You would say there's no institutional racism anymore, right? How do you think about the history of racism? Like, how do you, today? Where are we today, and how did we get here?
Correct. I don't believe there's institutional racism anymore. I had to think about that for a second. There was institutional racism in the college admissions against Asian Americans. And if you could prove to me like that there is a collusion, which I define institutional racism as collusion of entities for the purpose of denying equal opportunities. There's collusion in the Ivy Leagues. Everybody knew that, against Asians. So that was institutional racism. But no, it's not anymore. And it does not mean that there isn't a legacy of racism, which is different from institutional racism. It does not mean that like the fact that Black Americans were denied of a lot of wealth producing entities have historically informed them, and have this, in the present sort of informed their current position. I think that that's also true. But it's also true that a lot of Asian Americans also come here with no wealth, no income, no social connections. And within one generation, they're doing a lot better than Black Americans who are coming from similar, even more advantageous positions, such as the fact that they speak English, and a lot of Asian Americans come here and they don't speak English. So at that point, you have to turn into a cultural argument. You have to say, well, why in one generation? Is it racism specifically against Blacks that's at work here? Or is it just the fact that Asian Americans have higher two-parent family structures, they study twice as many hours a week, and they do less drugs and they do less crime?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just to sort of finish this, train of thought, like an implicit bias. So you say there's no implicit bias in society. How do you think about that?
There's no provable implicit bias in society.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is the standard of saying that someone is implicitly biased, I think, needs to be raised, highly, highly raised, because I could just say, well, you just assume things about me because I'm Asian. And I used to have this fear, like that people would assume things about me because I was Asian. And I can't really stop you from saying, yeah, from you having stereotypes about me because I'm Asian, but I can't prove it. So why am I going down this road? All it does is victimize myself, prevents me from having a normal relationship with you. If I think there's so many negative effects of me believing that you're implicitly biased against me to myself, that I just don't want to believe it.
Okay.
And there's no use to believing it. There's just no use.
Okay. And then, but if we go back in history, obviously things change. So like if we look at like the history of the housing administration's loans, to veterans coming back from World War II, which like explicitly excluded Black people, like that's clearly racist, right? I mean, or we look at policies like blockbusting and redlining, and protective covenants that excluded Black people from neighborhoods. That would clearly be examples of institutional racism from like the recent past, right?
Sort of. So I don't believe everything that they tell you, because I believe that some of history is being revised as we speak. For example, the whole redlining thing. People will say they redlined specifically Black areas that were disproportionately Black, but the vast majority of the areas that they redlined were still white. They were still completely white. So, and in many of these places, like 75% of no, not like 75%. I have a source, which I can point to on this article from Quillette called The Racism Treadmill by Coleman Hughes, that shares a source that the government, 75% of the redlined areas were white. So it's not a specifically racist policy. It just happened that Black Americans also lived in kind of disadvantageous areas. It doesn't mean it was a good policy. I still think it was a bad policy, but it's not a racist policy.
Okay. I can think of an example from very recent memory. Like I remember listening to an NPR piece, and this was very interesting because it was about New York City, and I'm adjacent to New York City, and it's about white liberals like me, right? These people who go to Whole Foods and drive their hybrid cars, and send their kids to the best public schools in the nation.
Go to Whole Foods.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I don't know. I'm stereotyping myself, but you understand what I mean. And it's about these this liberal elite, NPR listener, and that's what this piece was about. And it talks about how there was a school board fight within New York City, because in one of the top New York City public schools, they wanted to redistrict, and redistricting would allow Black kids, like a lot more Black kids into the school. And you have these like white liberal elites like myself, standing up in the meeting and saying like, we can't do this. There's going to be an increase of crime. I don't want my kid, and it's like a very like they're not saying it's about race, but you could tell like they just don't want Black kids in the school with their kids. To me, as someone who grew up in that world, that feels very real. Like that feels like very familiar, like a white liberal elite, which is very comfortable living only with other white liberal elites.
Let me ask you, Amy, does it? Have you ever been to a school board meeting?
Never.
Okay, if you go to a school board meeting, will you ever see somebody say something like, I don't like your proposal because it helps too many Black people or it brings Black people into my neighborhood?
No.
You will never.
I think they would couch it in other language that sort of implies the same.
But there are other reasons why people don't like redistricting. One of the things that I've learned actually going to school board meetings, including school board meetings where Eliza Shapiro from the New York Times was at as well, and actually listening to those school board meetings, is that reporters are nasty. They will selectively cover and spin quotes out of context all the time. I guarantee you that if you actually went to those school board meetings that NPR was talking about, instead of whatever Eliza Shapiro's coverage of that is, and I have a special disaffection for Eliza Shapiro because she was the one who claimed that the Asians were against Black people. because that they wanted to keep the standardized exam for gifted and talented people in New York City. Special disdain for her. But if you actually go to these school board meetings, you realize no one will ever say anything that is remotely racist, and most of the reasons for opposing a certain policy are grounded in something that is at least reasonable or legitimate.
Mm-hmm. 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 Interesting. So, yeah, I wonder though if I can fully get on board with that, what you're saying, but I wonder if from another perspective, you say it's not about is the person racist or anything, but it's about the outcome, right? Like if the outcome is that barriers are put in the face of assimilation of like a mixing of communities, that's a bad outcome, right? I mean, I think so. I assume you think so. Oh no, I'm getting a visitor from my daughter. Hold on a second. Uh-oh. Sorry about this.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, the last thing I was saying though was that I wonder if there's a second perspective which looks at the outcome, and we could say, granted, Kenny, that no one in that meeting is racist. Granted, but it still creates an outcome where the division of neighborhoods and the division of white schools and black schools is preserved. And so, can we at least say that these are outcomes that are not desirable in America? And if so,
Okay.
can we say like, well, maybe it's not racist people, but it's like it's racist outcomes in the sense that the outcomes perpetuate a scenario, experiences which are bad for black people.
So you're talking about the racist white people, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm talking about the liberal
So
elites
what
in
if I
these school
told
board
you
meetings. Yeah.
a completely random and probably horrible, crazy idea
Mhm.
that maybe neighborhoods are segregated because also Black Americans want it that way too? People tend to congregate with people in their own circles, their own communities, who they like to barbecue with. There is no barrier except for money, granted, but there's no barrier in towards if you are a black person right now and you wanted to live in a 99% white neighborhood, you could buy a house. And we have every law in America that protects you in your ability to buy that house. A lot of them just don't want to. That's okay. Whatever. I'm fine with
Except for
that.
that kid from Baltimore, right? Who said that they were
The
trapped in
whirlpool,
Baltimore. The
the
whirlpool, yeah.
whirlpool. I said except for money. He doesn't have any money. He's kind of broke.
Okay.
No
Okay.
offense to this guy. Poor guy. Yeah. So it's capitalism. That's what it
I
is.
see. Okay.
But I will tell you, in Atlanta, um, what did I say? Atlanta. Oh, oh yeah. Atlanta is one of the highest income black cities in America. It's known as like a black mecca for that reason. In the
Mhm.
suburbs, you see, upper middle class neighborhoods where anybody who's getting out of the hood are moving to the suburbs. And it's like that's what's happening over in Atlanta. So it could happen there, it could happen anywhere.
Yeah. Um, when I think back at my schooling career in high school, I went to a private school with all white kids. And I think about the way in which like high school kids are so insane and like so stupid. The way in which like, you know, they harassed and bullied our physics teacher so that he like stopped showing up to class. The way in which like kids did, like horrible things like excessive drug and alcohol abuse and like vandalized things. But I felt like there was always a sense like because we came from money, because we were like Long Island, New York, suburban, white, upper middle class kids, like we were always safe, like we were always be taken care of. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like that's such a privilege that I grew up with that a lot of kids in America don't have. Does that make sense?
It is a privilege.
Yeah.
So yeah, where are you going with that?
I feel like, in the case of when we talk about policing of schools and we talk about, kids acting out and how to handle it, or, there's there's a sense of like tough love where, we should go hard on them for their own good. And, and I think there's a very strong argument to be made for that. And I think in many cases, that's probably the right argument. But I think that it creates like two different experiences, you know, where some people for money have like infinite flexibility and choices and can make fuck ups and can bring pot to school and, you know, do whatever and like have no consequences. And another class of people who don't have money are subject to a much tougher system. So to me, it's just sad. And it feels like systemic in America from my perspective.
So here's an alternative way of looking at it.
Mhm.
The people who don't have money need a much tougher system because it's the tough people who are looking out for them, who are telling them, you better get out of your culture of depravity or you're not going to succeed in this country.
Mhm. Okay.
By the way, I feel the same thing about rich kids. I think rich kids need a tougher system too.
That's fair. You know, I felt this the most when I saw the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. I said, I grew up with Brett Kavanaughs. I grew up with kids who could like write in their yearbook about all the alcohol they consumed and all the girls they slept with and, you know, can get accused of rape. And they just knew because they were like from the privileged class, nothing would happen to them, you know, and you could become a Supreme Court justice, you know? So that I felt that in that case a lot.
Yeah, look, I mean, yeah. No, I mean, I supported Brett Kavanaugh in the nominations. I think that you just can't come out with like after 40 years and have an accusation that would ruin that man's career. I'm sorry, it's just not the time to do it anymore. You can't do that. Not in a just society. But I agree with you on the point about yeah, there are definitely entitled, privileged brats in our country. And as long as you have rich people, you will have those people. But there are rich people who work hard, who get there. And by the way, that's sort of like a classic cycle of decadence. It's like John Rockefeller gets in there, was super hard nosed, conservative Baptist person, one wife, and then, you know, his kids slowly go down and his grandkids slowly go down. And then, you know, it just leaves kind of a legacy of decline. So that tends to happen.
Yeah. You know, and listen, I've worked in high schools. I was a high school wrestling coach for a few years. And in a similar high school to the one that I went to. And sort of like what I learned is like just kids are stupid in a way. You know, it sounds negative, it sounds dumb, but like it's also okay. Like it's the time to be stupid. You know, it's a time to, you know, so there's a balance there. And I think it's a hard line to walk. And so yeah, I mean I think it's interesting to sort of think about that, think about those different approaches, you know.
Sure.
How would you want, I think we may have touched on this already to some extent, but like just yeah, I mean, maybe if you feel like you've already answered this, that's fine. But like the way history of America should be taught, you know, how should we talk about and teach the history of race in America to our kids? Because this legacy of slavery is major. And when you're dealing with low income communities, you're dealing with schools that are in low income communities that have a very large Black population in them. And you're talking about slavery, and you're talking about Reconstruction, and you're talking about Jim Crow. These are very explosive issues. You know, like I'm Jewish.
Right.
I never had the experience of living in Germany, learning about the Holocaust. You know what I'm saying? But that's an intense experience. You know, and there are people who've had that experience, of course. So yeah, how do you think that part of American history, especially as it pertains to teaching young people, should be handled?
Yeah, and Germans are not allowed to speak well of the Holocaust anymore. That is a free speech right that has been that we as Americans would think is a free speech right, but Germans don't. And that just shows how far that tragedy has happened and has impacted that country. But I would say sort of in a similar vein, like we just need to tell the truth. And history should be about truth. So like, what's the truth? I mean, sorry, I got a little off track on that. First of all, somebody has to be old enough. I forgot to mention this part. Somebody has to be old enough to learn about something like this. Okay. This is a very sensitive issue, and it is potentially to be traumatizing for Black kids if they learn about slavery in the wrong way. Here's how you can learn about slavery in the wrong way if you're a Black kid. You learn that America is a horrible racist country, has always been a horrible racist country, and will always be a horrible racist country because of slavery. You know what that teaches you? It teaches you that you're not going to succeed in this country. It's no use to even try because you're always going to be a second-class citizen. We want to avoid that fate. You have to be old enough to learn, and you have to be old enough to handle this. And the curricula has to also be taught in a way that it shows the immense moral progress that our country has made in confronting slavery, from fighting the Civil War to beating Jim Crow to advancing civil rights. The current books that are being marketed to Black children today do not teach that. They teach the opposite of that. Look, that's in my book, School of Woke. The book Dear Martin starts out with a scene where a kid is accosted by a white police officer and there's one theme throughout the entire book, which is America's racism towards him. I mean, it's so sad and so dispiriting, and it's going to instill for you a fear of other people based on their skin color. I don't support that.
Okay. That makes sense. We've been flying through my questions. I just want to take a second. Like I mean, I want to make sure I cover what you want to talk about well. So I'll ask the right question to ask here. You talk a lot about bureaucracy in your book. You talk a lot about this sort of the way in which there's an intersection between critical race theory and bureaucracy and corruption. Can you speak to that a little bit? What role corruption plays in our school system and things like that?
The first thing you should know about the school system is that it's not your mommy and daddy school system anymore. Yes, most of the people still are there with good intentions, but there are definitely people with horrible intentions in our school system in positions of power. And the reason why is because they have used the school system as either a pot of gold for themselves or as an activist pseudo-Marxist rallying center for their ideology, or both. And this is because we've overfunded the public education system. We've spent
Sorry. Sorry, it's not easy. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
So yeah.
Pot of gold. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pot of gold. Pot of gold or Marxist ideological place. So so bureaucrats will use that to their advantage. And this is not your mommy and daddy school system anymore. We've spent 3 times as much money on the public education system adjusted for inflation over the past 40 years, mostly to hire new administrators. The administrators are not day-to-day teaching children. They're instead making governing policies that often make it harder for teachers to teach their children. We're losing the fundamental relationship that builds up the school, which is the learning relationship between teacher and child. We are losing our focus in the school system. As a result, we spent a lot of money on things that don't help students. One of those is DEI. Another one of those is social emotional learning, this whole idea that we need to survey kids on their emotional health and everything like that. I'm sorry, not the school's responsibility, family's responsibility. And then we're also spending money on tech, bringing laptops to kids in middle school so that they can get addicted to laptops. Why do they need laptops? I'm sorry, people have learned science and math and reading at a far higher level than our kids are learning right now with only a pen and paper. You need to teach kids that hard work leads to good outcomes. And in order to do that, you need to replace a lot of these sort of quote unquote innovations that they're doing in the school system.
Yeah, I think a big blind spot that people on the left can have is the fact that local politics, especially, can be rife with corruption, including school board politics. And I think if the book has a message along those lines, it seems to me the message is to be involved, right, democratically, and to understand what's happening and to follow these the political evolution of your local community and your local school, and to be involved. And if that is, I think, the message of the book, part of the message of the book, I wholeheartedly endorse that. And I think that our country can only benefit from more engagement with local politics and these issues.
I agree. I think people need to be vigilant. We've ignored our school system for a while as a country politically. We've said, let's not get involved with politics. We've also said, let's trust the credentialed bureaucrats to do their job. We can no longer say that. I think people on both sides of the aisle can no longer say that. The credentialed bureaucrats are not doing their job. The results speak for themselves. The racial achievement gap has not closed. Test scores have not increased. We spend all this money on administration. Teachers aren't even getting paid. Okay, so they're not doing their job. So yeah, we need to exercise vigilance over the school system that we presupposedly call public.
Okay, yeah. So again, as we have this conversation, what comes to mind is the metaphor, is the analogy of harm reduction. I imagine if I spoke to a teacher in this scenario, who felt like they were on the receiving end of that criticism, they would say, listen, I'm doing the best I can. This is like, you're saying that my kids aren't passing, you're saying my kids are failing, or say that, you're not happy with like the fact that I'm bringing politics into my classroom. They say like, there's like a harm reduction argument there, right? Even if you disagree with it, that would be the other side. Because I assume for the most part, teachers are doing the best they can. I have a what's it called, like a bias of like good faith and confidence in America's teachers, which I think people mostly go into for the right reasons. And so I just imagine the flip side of that coin is like, you can take the hardline sort of tough love approach, or you could take this harm reduction approach. But we can talk about that. Yeah.
As you can see in this whole conversation, I've never truly faulted teachers as a whole. I do agree that a lot of them are doing the best they can. I think some of them are definitely hired who are less qualified to teach in areas that they shouldn't be teaching. But that is an argument on an individual level. I've definitely seen it. But really, like, if you've taken a look at sort of the buildup of the clot of bureaucracy and grift in the school system, you realize that a lot of it comes from the incentives that the federal government and the state governments peddle upon the school system. Various businesses getting involved. Mark Zuckerberg saying, I want to be, quote unquote, very active with the education system, rings a bell to me. Why would he want to be so active on the education system? Why can't he do his business indoctrinating kids on his social media platform instead? So it's you gotta be careful.
All right. So Kenny, thank you so much for talking to me today. I think your book was a very interesting read that deals with a lot of issues that are super important today, and you might say critical. And I think this discussion was super interesting and fruitful, and really one of my favorites. So once again, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I try to make this book, by the way, accessible to readers of all persuasions, as many people as possible. Definitely has a controversial title for sure, but it addresses systems and it addresses incentives and bureaucrats. So anybody who is literally interested in learning about the K-12 education system should get this book. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.